And we're picking up on Chapter 11 of Barry and the Boys, the CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History by Daniel Hopsicker. Not just an adventure, but a job. You know there aren't all that many players out there. Former U.S. Customs official Steve Wallner, who had tracked Barry Seal in the 80s, told us, "You can't count 'em pretty. You can count 'em pretty much on one hand." Professor Peter Dale Scott talks about the Kennedy assassination being the result of deep politics, as opposed to conspiracy theory. Secrecy and law breaking are how our deep political system works, Scott says. It's not a high cabal of Satan worshipping Illuminati that brought the scourges of the past 40 years. The assassination of a president, Vietnam, Watergate, Iran Contra, CIA, drugs, it's just the way things are. The concept of deep politics sees what happens as the normal result of how our system works, and it fits with what we're learning about the young Barry Seal and the organization to which he belonged. Did Seal wake up in the morning, rub his meaty paws together, and exclaim out loud, "Today I'm going to conspire to fly weapons to rebel insurgents"? Or "Today I'm going to go out and create a cocaine epidemic in America"? We don't think so. We think secret agent man Barry Seal got hung up in the morning exactly the same way most Americans do. Rubbed his eyes, sprinkled too much sugar on his cornflakes, and said, "Today I'm going to go to work." After you've been doing it for a while, it's not just an adventure, it's a job. A bunch of guys conducting business as usual. Here's a big question. Just what is this business that a work that Here's the question. Just what is this business that work a day soldiers to fortune toil so diligently? What exactly is it that spooks do during the odd hours when they're not busy making the world safe for democracy? What activity do Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, Barry Seal, Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Gordon Novell, Michael McLaney, and Meyer Lansky all share in common? Under normal circumstances, would homosexual and pedophile David Ferry hang out with cigar-chomping, commie-hating Guy Bannister? What would they find to talk about? And what did violence-loving Jack Ruby have? What what did violence loving Jack Ruby he enjoyed being his own bouncer in his strip club share in common with supposed Marxist intellectual Lee Oswald? They worked together. They all saw each other at the office, at the airport, or at the odd Klan cross burning that functioned as cover for some of them. It's not that they're personally close. They're like people who see each other maybe once a year at some gift show convention. As it happens, the industry these men were in was enjoying a major boom at the time. Their business is weapons and narcotics, which together comprise just one industry because who controls the one inevitably controls the other. Jack Ruby, to cite one example, Professor Scott shows him to be involved in narcotics trafficking as far back as the late 1940s. Talk about being ahead of the curve. We're amazed to learn that by 1956, Ruby was doing so well in narcotics that he was showing training films to potential recruits into the organization. When a pimp named James Breen met with Ruby to discuss collaborating in running 3 prostitutes, he found Ruby, bursting with loftier ambitions, showed Breen an early narco industry training and recruiting film, exciting enthusiasm in his new recruit in an extremely efficient operation in connection with narcotics traffic. Typical loads were valued at over $300,000. In 1956, that was real money. The other big action is in weapons. This perhaps explains why, to a startling degree, the lead characters in our story almost all involved in smuggling weapons as if they all worked for a giant superstore called Guns R Us. This is why they all know each other. Our U.S. Customs agent friend was right about there not being all that many players. Lee Oswald knows Jack Ruby based on too many witnesses for even the FBI to ignore. Oswald also knows Ferry. Oswald knows Barry Seal. Seal knows Ferry, and based on flight plans and his pilot logs, may have also known Jack Ruby. And everybody knows Guy Bannister. Jack Ruby was deeply involved in the gun running to Cuba. Even back in 1964, this was hardly a secret to the Warren Commission. Tales of Ruby running guns abounded in FBI reports taken in the first weeks after the assassination, but neither the Warren Commission nor the House Select Committee, a dozen years later, pursued those leads very far. Dallas agent expressed concern over this cover-up in the late 1963, saying that neither the Oswald's Cuban interests in Dallas nor Ruby's Cuban activities have been adequately explored. By the late 1950s, according to his own Warren Commission testimony, Jack Ruby had developed an affinity for all things Cuban, and his trail crossed with those of the most powerful organized crime figures in America. While the syndicate was engaged in Cuba, Ruby in on the action, and his Cuban activities provide a glimpse behind the heavy velvet drapes shielding the American people from the facts about their national security and the mob. According to a former Ruby associate, James Beard, Ruby stored guns and ammo in the late 1950s at a house on the South Texas coast before ferrying the equipment into Cuba. Beard said he personally saw many boxes of new guns, including automatic rifles and handguns, loaded aboard military surplus boats, and claimed that each time the boat left with guns and ammunition, Jack Ruby was on it. The shipments, said Beard, were destined for the followers of Fidel Castro, then still fighting Batista. Jack Ruby may even have been into gun running as far back as the late 40s. After the Kennedy assassination, a pilot in Miami named Mac Blaney Johnson told the FBI that while he was flying cargo from Miami to Havana, he learned of illegal flights for the Castro organization arranged by Ruby, then known as Jack Rubenstein. And a recently declassified CIA report shows CIA agents in New Orleans making inquiries about Ruby in 1959. Why would a CIA operative be interested in activities of a small-time Dallas huckster? During the same time, federal investigators also... During the same time, federal investigators are also tracking the activities of both Barry Seal and David Ferry, because all three are doing the same thing. They're running guns to Cuba. A Miami FBI report on Ruby revealed his connections to pilot Eddie Browder, who had flown cargo to Cuba and was affiliated with a Miami gambling casino in which Jack Ruby also held an interest, whose principals included Meyer Lansky, a name which will most assuredly not surface in the Warren Commission report. Browder had also been a pilot in the CIA coup in Guatemala. Small world. His sons later told reporters, "My dad got shot down in that operation, and when the surviving members of the Arbenz government fled, they took some prisoners with them. My dad was in an unofficial prison that the Mexican government let the Guatemalan exiles run in Mexico." Ruby also turn ups in exactly the same place, in the Florida Keys, which had been used earlier as a storage point in the Guatemalan coup. His pilot Browder was also smuggling with mobster Norman Roughhouse Rothman, one of the Santos Traficante's close associates who ran a Havana casino. Rothman was known as the slot machine king of Cuba. Through the practical expedient of having gone into partnership with the brother-in-law of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Almost 2 decades after the Kennedy assassination, Rothman and Barry Seal will be arrested as part of the same major drug bust in Florida. The Miami Herald, in its coverage of the arrest, said of Rothman, Norman Roughhouse Rothman, 67, asthmatic, surfside gun runner, and organized crime associate, has been convicted 3 times, most recently for selling a machine gun to federal agents. He once ran a Havana casino in 1960, and in 1960 he once ran a Havana casino and in 1960 was convicted of trying to fly stolen weapons to anti-Castro rebels in Cuba. Roughhouse Rothman is not a name that has surfaced with Barry Seals before. The official story attempts to describe Seal as a historical anomaly, a once-in-a-lifetime comet Kakutek of drug smuggling. As we are beginning to see, nothing could be further from the truth. Rothman first came to the attention of the CIA while residing in Dallas in 1958. That year, he masterminded the nifty heist of over $13 million in bonds, cash, and jewelry stolen from the Brockville Trust in Ontario, Canada. When Montreal investigators later busted Giuseppe Controni, described as an Eastern Canadian racket figure, they found $10,000 worth of stolen bonds. What had happened was that the Canadian branch of the mob, the Controni family, had received a hurry-up order for guns from Fidel Castro. Mobster Rothman and Controni got the call. Soon there was a big weapons heist from a National Guard armory at Canton, Ohio. Knocking over National Guard armories had become, for the boys, something like the hula hoop fad then sweeping the country. During a rash of such robberies across the South, Barry Seal, we learned, had been given the keys to the Baton Rouge Armory in preparation for a heist. It happened in 1960, according to one of Seal's lifelong friends, Jerry Chidney. Barry came in after a trip to St. Bartholomew Island, out at the furthest tip of an island chain not far from Venezuela, and somebody had given him the keys to the armory and the gun racks, recalls Chidney. I was just a little punk kid with a coffee house, and Barry said he had a way he could make $5,000. 2 plainclothes cops were to stand guard, and they drove the guns in an unmarked police van out to the Hammond, Louisiana airport, where they were loaded into a DC-3 and then flown to Guatemala. Chidney found it all amazing. Here is a guy, Seal, who at the age of 22 has secured keys to a armory, the support of plainclothes police, and an escort to a DC-4 in Hammond. It was incredible. The cops said that in exchange for their help, they had been promised appointments to the FBI Academy, he continued. So that would seem to establish an FBI connection of some kind. But later I flew to Dallas, and 2 guys in black suits who I took to be FBI followed me. So I never could quite figure it out. But that was Barry, I guess. Always a bit of a mystery there, for sure. Less than a month after Rothman and Controni's similar Canton, Ohio armory raid, the weapons had been loaded onto a plane bound for Cuba, which was tracked on radar by the Border Patrol. The weapons stolen were recovered, and Roughhouse Rothman was presumably on his way to the Big Barn charged with arms smuggling, interstate transportation of stolen property, and conspiracy. But being connected means never having to say you're sorry. By the end of the year, he was back on the street, helping Fulgencio Batista establish an exile headquarters at the Baltimore Terrace Hotel on Miami Beach, which he managed. Wait a minute. We've just seen that it is thanks to CIA-backed gangsters like Rothman and Ruby that Fidel Castro outgunned Batista in the first place. Why is Rothman now backing the man he just helped replace? What's going on here? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, when school-age American kids were taught to hunker under their school desks in the event of Russian nuclear attack, we were learning these skills just so mobsters and CIA guys could make a buck churning weapons? Roughhouse Rothman was eventually convicted of attempting to smuggle guns stolen from the National Guard armory, but it didn't slow him down. When interviewed while out on appeal, he stated bitterly that he was being prosecuted for the same activities which were being regularly conducted by the CIA. Also doing a bit of time for the stolen security heist was pilot Eddie Brower, and while the FBI supplied several reports to the Warren Commission concerning Browder, they withheld hundreds of others featuring his involvement in gun running to Cuba and the stolen Canadian securities in activities controlled by Norman Rothman. Browder stated in a deposition that he received the stolen securities from the 26th of July movement, Fidel Castro's group, in exchange for arms during the summer of 1958, and in another bombshell admitted that he'd traded them for weapons from the International Armament Corporation, Interarms, in Alexandria, Virginia. And since Interarms is just another way to say CIA, it looks as if it was no coincidence that Norman Rothman first came to the attention of the CIA at the same time as the big heist. The conclusion is unmistakable. The boys were demonstrably splitting the take from the sale of stolen Canadian securities. Last but clearly not least, CIA agent Frank Sturgis also admitted having been being involved in this operation to the Rockefeller Commission in the mid-1970s. The weapons had been hidden in the marshes of Islamorada, Florida, exactly where Jack Ruby will be identified as having been babysitting a large arms cache. When Barry Seal is arrested with Roughhouse Rothman 20 years later, another man arrested is William Obie Aubrant, called the financier for Controni, the Canadian mobster who started the stolen Canadian securities bankrolling way back in '57. The 60-year-old Aubrant of Bal Harbour, a former Montreal meatpacker, has been described by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a financier for the Controni organized crime family. Read the Miami Herald. Aubrant, a 59-year-old French-Canadian charged last year with running a $50 million Quaalude smuggling ring, has reportedly told undercover drug agents that every Quaalude tablet in South Florida is controlled by me. Controni was also described during the Senate narcotics hearings in the early 1980s as head of the largest and most notorious narcotics syndicate on the North American continent. During the decade-long intrigue leading up to the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, these are the people with whom and for whom Barry Seal worked flying missions into Cuba. Much later, when the ghost of Barry Seal and the Mina scandal stand briefly in the path of Bill Clinton's presidential ambitions, drug pilot William Bottoms will rush forward to assure us that Barry Seal was nothing but transportation for the Medellin cartel. As we're beginning to see, Barry Seal's roots in the deep political system could go, as they say in the South, quite a little bit deeper than that. And that's it for today.